I'm not even going to pretend that my room is clean right now. So just ignore everything behind me. Um, okay, so to get this movie started, um, by the way, I am also drinking tea at night. The good thing. I'm going to call this Tea with Ben. I think that's a good idea. Tea with Ben. And also cookies. So, since I posted that video the other day, and I went through a bit of vulnerability doing that, I've been racking my head around what do I want to say on this channel. Like, why have a channel that I'm going to post content on if I don't have anything to say? And I have a lot of things to say. I don't. It's a process actually putting it out there, right? But I know that I do want to put it out there, even if it's just for my own benefit and the 7 people who follow me on this, right? Um, so what I want to talk about tonight is particularly spirituality and why it's so important to me, but also why it's so important to my queer identity. I think that in many ways, both my queerness and my spirituality have been two really big parts of my life, next to my Britishness, and all three have really kind of collided in many ways. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk a little bit about my spiritual journey, a little bit more about why spirituality is so important to me, and also talk little bit about why and how that spirituality has impacted my queerness and intersected with it. So, for those of you who don't know me, for those maybe 7 of you who don't know me, my name is Ben Stimson. I have been part of the pagan community now for about almost coming up to 20 years. I started originally when I was a teenager, and that's kind of an interesting story in itself, kind of where that spirituality came from. So, backstory, I came from the UK. I was born in North Wales, and we moved over here when I was 9. We moved to Ontario, and then 2 years we kind of lived in Barrie, Ontario, and then ended up moving to where I grew up, my hometown. And I was there until I was about 18 when I moved to Toronto. So, really formative years of my life. What I've come to realize, and it took going into a spiritual retreat to understand this, was that shock of immigrating to Canada affected me quite deeply. For many years after we moved, I wasn't entirely sure who I was. I was suddenly, different when I moved to Canada. At eight and a half years old, right? I was suddenly different. This is in spite of growing up having dyspraxia, having to go through speech therapy, and a few other things, right? Wearing glasses, not being good at sports when I was in the UK, all of these things. But when I lived there, I was just the little kid, My accent matched the kids I was growing up with. I was from there. I went to school 20 minutes from where I was born. So, I was from that place. And I didn't understand myself as different because my parents and the people and the teachers and the kids around me when I was growing up did a really good job just normalizing some of the things I was dealing with. And then I moved to Canada, and I was different. I had an accent. I was smaller than some of the other kids. I spoke differently, right? The language that I was using was different. So I was suddenly very different. And then we moved to the middle of nowhere, which, I mean, it's not the middle of nowhere. It's a beautiful part of Canada. I really, really like my hometown. But back then it was the middle of nowhere. It was a sleepy little village in the middle of nowhere. And everybody I went to school with was related. Meanwhile, all my extended family is back in the UK. So all there was my parents and my brother and sister. So I was suddenly different, and then of course when I started to realize I was gay, I was even more different, and I was just different, right? So imagine a young different kid, right? Growing up in a place that they were absolutely miserable in. And to be honest, I was miserable. I was very homesick for the idea of the UK that I had in my head. I was bullied quite a bit when I was younger because I was different. And so was my sister, so was my brother, even though he won't admit it. But we were all bullied, um, and so I was suddenly in a position where in those formative years, 11, 12, 13, I had no idea who I was. If you had asked me when I was 13 years old what my interests were, I couldn't tell you. I had no idea who I was. And even now, like, it only took me until a few years ago to really fully understand who I was. And even now, that fully understanding is still evolving, and. So when I was about 14, 15, 14, 15, and I remember just I remember it vividly. I was tasked in grade 10 to do an assignment where I created a coat of arms. And the coat of arms had to be filled with all of the elements of my life, things that made me who I was. Thinking back on it now, is one of the most fantastic assignments you could have done and given to a kid. And so what I did was I started to think about, okay, well, what is Britishness? What is that Britishness, right? Because I so strongly identified still as British, because, fun fact, I wasn't British until I came over here, right? I was suddenly so different from the people who I was surrounded by over here, and they identified me as British, therefore I was British. If I had grown up in the UK, my self-identity would have been very different, I think. But it is what it is, we can't change it, right? So I started to look and kind of explore, and I started to think about, okay, well, what is Britishness? And ironically, around that time, I think it was like 2001. Yeah, 2001. It must have been about 2001. The Mists of Avalon TV series had come out. And I'd always been very interested in, Arthurian mythology and stories of gods and things like that. And I'm not even sure where that really came from, except, I mean, it's such an integral part of our culture, right? So like Robin Hood and King Arthur and Oliver Merlin, very strong characters in British mythology. So I saw the Mists of Avalon and I was intrigued. There was something in it, this idea of an ancient land filled with magic and all of this. And I had grown up in the 1990s, surrounded by, like books about, the UK, and in particular there was one book, Ghosts and Legends of Wales, which I absolutely loved. And I ended up giving that away to somebody a few years later, and ended up buying myself a copy again, because it was just it's one of those books that when I think of my childhood, it's always there. And so magic and like mythology and ghosts and witches and things like that were always kind of in the background for me. And so I was like, okay, well, we'll look into this. I was 14 at this point. And so I started looking into goddess worship, this goddess, British goddess, all this. And around that same time, the internet had become really a lot more popular. Beforehand, you would have had to go to libraries or schools, but we got it in the home around that time, and that caused some issues, but that's all of the story. But I started looking into like goddess worship, and I came across Wicca, and I was like, this is interesting, because what I'm seeing in this 14-year-old self, what I'm seeing in this is an authentic British spirituality that is something I can really connect with. And from there, I started to kind of explore it a bit more, and I placed the pentagram in my coat of arms for that class. And I didn't really know what it meant, to be honest. Let's be honest here. I had no idea what it meant at that time, but I just know there was an interest, there was something in it. So then I started watching a few more movies about magic and witchcraft and things like that. Buffy the Vampire Slayer was a big part of that too, but I hadn't quite made that connection at that point. Really, the Mists of Avalon and reading the Mists of Avalon was such a pivotal moment in that time. Around that time, I was also coming out as gay. So the two were really intertwined, because I knew that, spiritually at least, I knew I couldn't be Christian, because in the town I grew up in, there were 18 churches, and every single one of them, 18 churches for a town of like 7,000 people, a little overkill, right? but there were 18 churches and none of them seemed accepting of gay people. This is what I was hearing, this is what I was seeing, this is what I was feeling, you know. So I started to explore alternative spiritualities, and I got onto Witchvox, which is, or was, I should say, it's now permanently disabled and gone, but it was the premium place that you could connect with people. You could put a profile up there, connect with people, talk to people, and read articles. And I remember I started chatting to quite a few people on there because it was the great days of MSN Messenger and ICQ and all of those lovely instant messaging, AOL. So I put a profile on there, started chatting to a few people, and particularly I started chatting to people who were gay. Gay, pagan witches, right? Which was really, really mind-blowing to me, right? Because up until that point, I'd never actually met another gay person, even though I knew that I was gay, and I identified that way. So for me back then, at least as a teenager, it was an interlinking component between my British identity, my gay identity, and my spiritual identity. Spirituality became almost a safe haven for me because I was able to then choose these spiritualities for myself, as opposed to trying to fit into religious traditions that I just didn't feel comfortable in. And you have to understand, coming from a very typically English, my parents are English, I'm Welsh, but my parents are English, very typically English Church of England family. We go to church, well, my parents would have gone to church maybe 2 or 3 times a year. Christenings, funerals, and weddings, that was it. Easter celebration was watching Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments on television, and apart from that, Christmas was very much about celebrating by opening a bottle of alcohol, and that was it, right? So religiously, there wasn't a lot in the family that was religious, but for me, and I can't quite, I have to really sit down and really piece all this together because it seemed like it all happened really quickly. But, and the span of only maybe 3 or 4 years. But I met some people, one of my biggest crushes, first crushes, was on a guy who practiced witchcraft, and like to me, he was like, oh my God, he's amazing. He was only a couple of years older than me, but he seemed to have his life together, all of this, right? Who hasn't gone through an infatuation when they're like 15, right? So I met a couple of other people at that time who have now, like, they've come in and out of my life, and they're in my life again now. But the essence of it was I was able to control, and I was able to control what I was learning, and I was able to control my life by experimenting and experiencing these alternative spiritualities. I didn't have an authority who was coming down on me and saying, you're evil, you're evil, you're evil, you're bad, you're sinful, you're a sodomite, blah, 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 right? So flash forward to when I came into university. And I started to, I erected an altar. At that point, I was practicing Hinduism. I was really intrigued by Hinduism. A friend of mine who was pagan and also worshipped the goddess Kali introduced me to Hinduism, and I started really looking into it. And I really connected with it. I connected with the beauty of the imagery, because honestly, let's be honest here, Hindu imagery is gorgeous. And if you ever go into a mandir, a temple, and you see the beautiful color, richness of color, it's a living, alive, polytheistic tradition, and I absolutely loved it. Now, you can tell I'm a white guy, right? But I'd grown up since I was a kid eating curry, and my dad is very big into experimenting with different foods, so curry for me was a big thing. And then, of course, when I went to university, which is next to a large, well-known centre at Brampton in Toronto. And so there was a big Indian population that I was surrounded by. I had a load of Indian friends. And so I was able to experience Hinduism kind of from an outsider with a toe in as an insider, right? I'm not saying I'm an insider. Don't get me wrong. And what I found in Hinduism was interesting because I found deities that didn't care who I slept with. They didn't care who if I was sleeping with a guy. In fact, in many ways, Hinduism is very sex positive, although the culture of India is very patriarchal and non-sex positive, and really shaming of sexuality. When you look at Hinduism as a set of traditions, there's so much in it that is vibrant and filled with sacred sexuality. So imagine my surprise when I first started to realize that piece. I go from being kind of coming from an agnostic English family that normally went to the Church of England and Christianity, to seeing that I was never going to be accepted in Christianity, to because I was sinful and this and that and all the other, to paganism, which led me to Hinduism, which celebrated sexuality, right? Celebrated sacred sexuality. And Hinduism is still very important in my life. The deity that I worship primarily is Shiva, and his various consorts, were Parvati or her forms Kali, Durga, and these strong, energetic, feminine goddesses, right? So I started to kind of go through a slump in my life. I went through a big period in my life where there was a lot of change. I caused a lot of harm in my own life, and I needed to step back. And I went home after university, and I worked for my parents. I stayed at home for a few years, and I was a hermit, total hermit. I stayed at home, didn't do anything. I didn't drive, didn't see any friends, and I had a loss of identity. I wasn't sure who I was anymore, right? I wasn't sure where I was heading. I had no idea. And in about 2015, I started to branch out again. I started attending live action role play, and I started to reconnect with the pagan community. And I remember it was through LARP, actually, it was through live action role play, that I found a local campground that was quite close to where my parents were at the time. It was only an hour down the road, and it was a pagan campground. It was Mythwood. And those of you who know Mythwood, you'll know how amazing it was. And for those who don't, imagine suddenly you come across a group of people who are all interested in the same things you love, and who put into their lives their practice, their spiritual practice, and they seem to be healthy, and they seem to be really on the right path, right? Now, that being said, I learned, and I have learned, that nobody is on the right path. Everybody is on the path, but there's no such thing as the right path. There is a close path, there is a healthy path, but what's right for one person isn't going to be right for another person, and we're always constantly seeking, right? But that's a complete aside. So I started working with this group. There was about 150, 200 people connected with this group, and they put on a series of weekend festivals, so once in the summer and once in winter. And I ended up going to my first one in 2015, and I was chosen to take on an important symbolic role within this community. Because oh, ow, that's not good. Okay. I don't know how to edit that out yet, so you're just going to have to deal with me like squishing my eye just then. So how Mythwood and particularly the Tribal Hearth, which was the actual name of the group, and Mythwood was the campground that it was hosted at. What they did was they took Joseph Campbell's living mythology, or I should say Joseph Campbell's work, and of the living myth, and institute a series of ritual events that were centered on a story, and everybody had a part in the weekend of building this story and being part of the story and finding their place in the story. And I was chosen along with two other people to play a role in this ritual arc. And the arc went on for about seven events. And every event had a particular milestone or a particular goal or a particular focus of what we were working on. So one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had was standing or sitting, I should say, at 12 a.m. in a stone circle, because Mythwood, the owners of Mythwood had built a beautiful stone circle, had brought in these huge boulders and placed them around, and with 60 other people in the middle of one of Ontario's dark zones. It's so far removed from some of the local towns that it's a dark zone. You can see the stars above, and for 60 people in this stone circle at 12 o'clock at night, and we have singing bowls going, and we have this wonderfully built sacred space. And I don't want to speak too much about what happened in the circle, but it was powerful. That was my very first experience of a large group ritual in such a way, and it was magic. It was absolutely magic. So I started to come back into my spiritual side. For a few years, I was just paying lip service to it. It was, very theoretical for me. It was very intellectual for me, but it wasn't experiential. And so in 2015, I started to inch my way back into a practice, and I came into contact with a lot of people who they were putting their practice into practice. They were actually doing things as opposed to just kind of sitting around pontificating about it. I'm not saying that dismissively, right? But it was what I needed at that time. So since 2015, I've been on a journey. Becoming the seeker of that group was the exact thing I needed to get out of a rut in my life. And I started to work on myself, and I started to put plans in together. I went back to school. I joined with other traditions, so I still continued to practice Hinduism, but I really found my paganism and reconnected with my paganism. I joined the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, OBOD, which is a British-based Druid group, one of the largest, and certainly one of the oldest. And I started to become connected with Santeria, Lukumi, the Afro-Cuban tradition, and for many years have practiced that, or have been involved with it. I can't say I practice it, I'm involved in it. And then now, this piece around discovering myself as a queer individual, and redefining my queerness, outside of the labels that I was using before, gay, male, beginning to understand myself as a non-binary individual. In many ways, actually, it never really challenged my spirituality, because my spirituality, I realized, has always been about breaking chains for me. It has always been about forming that spirituality in a way that is going to be affirmative and supportive of my journey in life. And in many ways, introducing me to people who are going to shock me and shock my system and challenge me. There is a resounding interest in the queer community with things like, tarot cards, right? Or things like runes, or things like magic and witchcraft. And there's a reason why that is. It's because these traditions and these practices are outside the bounds of the patriarchal systems that we've evolved in our world, right? They create those liminal spaces to exist within. They're not quite religions, unless you make them that way, such as Wicca. They're not quite spiritualities, because there are, agnostic witches out there, and magicians who work with spirits who are not necessarily working with deities. They are liminal spaces that you can connect with forces that in many ways represent who we are and who we can find ourselves in, right? One of the deities that I have had a long soft spot for has been the Greek deity Hermes. And Hermes is, for me, one of the quintessential queer deities. Shiva is as well, let's be honest here. Hermes is a god of transaction. He is a psychopomp. He exists between spaces. His Roman counterpart, Mercury, is where we get our word mercurial, which for many people for many years was applied to queer individuals in the Victorian era and earlier than that, right? This idea of mercurial, strange, queer, right? And so when I started to become a lot more secure in my queerness and started to understand myself in different ways from how I had been expressing it before, and meeting people too, meeting, many gay witches, many, queer witches and queer pagans, and even queer members of the Lukumi community, queer members of the Druid community, I started to understand my own journey differently. I'm still processing it all. I'm understanding that liminal space, being different, which has been a hallmark of my entire life, is actually empowering, right? It is actually empowering, because who gives the f what definition somebody else is going to place on me, right? I also realized a few years ago that that when you add in that place of destiny, destiny is a large, destiny and fate is a large thing that I work with, and have become sensitive to. And there's whole stories about that. Actually, I think there is actually like an hour-long video of me just gushing into the camera from a few years ago about understanding these pieces. When I started to understand like the idea of again, personal destiny, but also the fate of all of us and how we are connected, I started to then understand where queer people are in that, because queer people are both outside of and within the structures of society. I started to understand then, how do I queer my practice when it comes to working with destiny and fate. 2 years ago, or a year ago? No, yeah, last year, I went to see my tattoo artist down in London, who is amazing. If anybody's in the London area and looking to support a queer artist, tattoo artist, his name is Kevin, and he runs the oh, this is embarrassing. The Ink Collective. I butchered that. It's not coming to me right now. I'll put it down in the comments. But I went down there with a very particular design I wanted, and that is the weird bind rune. So he did a really beautiful job with this. It is absolutely gorgeous. And what this bind rune actually is, so it comes from Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-Saxon idea of weird, of W-Y-R-D, weird, and is connected with the Norse Urd, and it's that sense of interconnectedness and destiny and personal destiny. And when you look at the bind rune itself, now this bind rune, this sigil, this mark, is a modern creation. It's not an ancient creation. But when you look at it, what I love about it, when you look at it, is all of the runes can be found within it. And so as the kind of the weird bind rune, the web of weird, that's another name for it, the web of weird. You can see that everything is interconnected, and every piece has an important piece. And so when I reflect on that from my non-binariness and non-binary identity, I see how that fits in with this idea of non-binary being outside of a binary. I don't identify as a man and I don't identify as a woman, but I'm me. But that isn't necessarily meaning that I'm completely out of the universe. I exist in those in-between spaces. And so I've been noticing that a lot of my spiritual tastes and interests have been shifting more towards that in-betweenness and finding power in that in-betweenness. Certainly a lot of my work with ancestor veneration. So for those of you who watch my other account or who've been involved, I started writing a book on ancestor veneration last year, and I ran a few classes from it. And ancestor veneration for me is being in that space between the ancestors who have gone and the descendants who are coming, and so sitting in that middle space as the the individual who is living right now. There's power in that, right? There's power in that. So that's really just a little rundown. I've gone for 30 minutes now. I just felt like I needed to say something and put something out there. My spirituality is continually evolving. There's a lot of pieces. So much has happened in the past 6 years, 7 years. So much has happened, and I still don't quite know really where it's heading. I certainly have become a lot more secure and confident in my spirituality and my relationships with spirits and deities, and then my place in this world. That's really where my spirituality is informing or helping to inform me, is where is my place in the world now as a 35-year-old individual, right? I'm approaching middle age, because 35 is not middle age. I'm just saying this right now. 35 is not middle age. I'm approaching middle age, and I'm trying to figure out then, what does that mean? How am I going to show up in the world in middle age, and it still boggles my mind. I have no idea how 35 happened, but it's happened, and it's something we all have to deal with. But I'm learning how to show up in the world, and I'm finding the confidence that I have wanted for all these years. And it's so funny because, I look a few years ago, I was self-styling myself as this, that, and all over, and the mystic, and blah, blah, blah. And I found that when I actually stopped trying to be something other than who I already am, I became those things, right? I became those things. I became the things that I've always wanted. I look in the mirror and I'm like, I am literally becoming the queer person who I have always wanted to be. I'm becoming the attractive individual that I have always wanted to be. And it isn't because I have changed anything. It's because I'm allowing myself to experiment and to explore, and then just looking in the mirror and liking who I am again, right? That's a big piece of it. And that's the other piece around my spirituality, around how that queerness comes into my spirituality. Because there's so many things about queer identity that I think is toxic and not healthy, and that comes from both the queer identity piece, but also the reaction of society towards queer people. If I had had the choice to be straight, cis, het, right, I'd have chosen that. I wouldn't have chosen to be gay. I wouldn't have chosen to be non-binary. I wouldn't have been chosen. I wouldn't have chosen any of this, right? I wouldn't have wanted this on my worst enemy. And I think you'll find a lot of us feel the same way. We certainly don't. We certainly don't revel in this. But at the same time, becoming secure in this, knowing that this is just who we are, at least in this lifetime, right? We'll talk about reincarnation at another point, but in this moment in our existence, in this lifetime of our existences, this is who we are. And it's how then do we, the authentic interior essence, shows up through this lens that is our various identities. And that's a lesson anybody can learn. And that's, I think, the journey for everybody, is learning how to show up authentically and be our true selves, right? Some of us it's as a non-binary gay person. Some of us it's as a white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed white lady in the suburbs. Somebody else it's growing up in another country. All of these things, right? We're all trying to figure this out. So anyways, now I'm rambling, so I will get off of this. I hope that was a little taste of my world, and I will speak to you all again. See you.